So welcome to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to be with Jane Duncan Rogers this morning. And Jane has the amazing company Before I Go Solutions. So Jane, I'm very excited to talk to you today. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, really is a pleasure.
Good. Well, the first question that I like to begin with is, how do you define grief?
Yeah, well, it's a big subject, and it's our emotional response. I say it's our emotional response to any loss of any kind. So although I focus on the loss called death, it actually applies to anything that you lose, big or small, and can take us by surprise. The thoughts and the feelings that come and the discombobulation that happens in your mind when you're going through grief can take us by surprise. So the more we know about it and what it looks like for us, the better.
And what happened in your life that led you to doing the work that you do?
Well, my husband was diagnosed with stomach cancer in 2010, out of the blue. There was no reason to suspect anything was wrong. And, well, you know, when that sort of thing happens, it stops you in your tracks. But looking back now, what happened was for the next year, well, of course, we didn't know how long it was going to last, but for the next year, which was in fact our last year together because he died in December 2011, we were focusing on how best to live with the presence of this disease in our life. And I was a coach. I had worked as a therapist and a trainer for most of my life. And I was also blogging, and I was blogging about what was going on in relationship to the business. And so I always knew that I would write about this major event that had happened in my life. And 3 years later, I produced this book, Gifted by Grief. Mm-hmm. Now, I just say something about the title, because when you first suffer a loss, you are very unlikely to feel like there's a gift in it. But given time, there is always a gift. There's always a gift in every situation, is my belief. And the gifts that I found personally were incredibly valuable, and that's what I write about in the book. But the thing that was surprised me about that book was that readers responded to a chapter where I had written about the questions that I'd asked my husband before he died. Now, these were really practical, like, what are your passwords? How do you want your body to be dressed? Do you have anything that is of sentimental value that you would want to go to somebody in particular? You know, I mean, they're quite difficult questions to answer at the best of times, let alone with somebody that you know probably only has a few months left to live, which was the case for us. But, you know, people responded to me and said, I need to answer these questions too. And that's basically how Before I Go Solutions began. And now that's 5 years on now. I published another book, Before I Go, The Essential Guide to Creating a Good End of Life Plan, which is an extension of those original questions and how to do it. But we also now focus on training people to be end of life plan facilitators, because what we've discovered is that even with the best will in the world and people understanding that this is a good idea and it's sensible to talk about this with your loved ones and plan in advance and all the rest of it, it's actually quite a challenge to get it done. It's a lot easier with somebody else guiding you, a companion on the journey, or even a group of like-minded people doing the same thing. So that's what we do.
That's amazing. Yeah. And like you were saying, when you're in the grief process, your mind is very discombobulated. So it's such a helpful thing to have somebody to help you navigate through all the bureaucracy that has to happen. And I love that you're helping people think about, you know, meaningful things that they may want to pass on as well. Yeah, because they might just be small keepsakes and things.
Exactly. Like that. But you see, that's the sort, I mean, it gave me a lot of pleasure to, for example, he had a beautiful plate that hung on a wall that had been given to him by a client. He used to be a psychotherapist. It was really, really lovely. And I asked him if he wanted it to be given to anybody in particular, and he named this person. And the pleasure that I got in giving that to them I had no idea that I would feel like that, but it felt so good. And they were really touched that he had said that he wanted them to have it. So it became a precious thing for them. It became good for Philip to know that that was going to happen. And me being the deliverer of that message, that was just lovely too. Little things like that, you don't realize how important they are until you get the opportunity to do it. Or unfortunately, most people don't get the opportunity, and then it's too late, of course.
Yeah, because it seems like a difficult conversation to have with your loved ones. But I actually brought this up in one of my groups that I do. It wasn't the grief group. I do another group called Cafe Conscious, and I do 1 week on death and grieving.
Great.
And and I was saying about this list of 10 things that you have come up with, and all the women in the group, they're plus 50 in that group. So they were saying, like, this is such a good idea. I'm going to start talking to my daughter about these things now. And they were really proactive. But I wonder if and they're not unwell, because sometimes people can be unwell, but very in denial, about thinking that they might die. So I guess there's never necessarily a good time to talk about these things, but I wonder if you had any advice, about how to suggest bringing up the conversation with ones.
Yeah, I do. So I think of this in terms of 3 C's. The 3 C's that you need to remember is that, first of all, you do need courage, because in our society at the moment, we don't, generally speaking, talk about this. Even with the pandemic having happened and lots more information out there about death, it's been more about statistics and the actual virus, not necessarily about how you actually start to have a conversation about this. So you need some courage, but you know what? Everybody's got courage. It's amazing the amount of courage you find when you're put into a crisis situation. So you need to draw on that and take the plunge. And what helps you to do that is the second C, which is having a context. It's really important that there is a context within which you begin to start this conversation. So, for example, if somebody arrives, if somebody just says out of the blue, what do you want for your funeral, for example, it's like, well, that's a bit in your face, isn't it? Because we don't talk about death as a sort of general thing in our society. It's too much out of the blue. So it might be the case that, for example, at the moment, Prince Philip is about to be buried. Everybody has a context, because it's out there. And this is what happens when a public figure dies. You immediately have a reason where you can say, gosh, I was reading about this in the newspaper the other day, made me think about what I would want. Have you thought about it? What would you want? And that's just about your funeral, and we can say this, it applies to any aspect of all the things that have to be thought about beforehand. So you need to have a context. And then the third thing I say, the third C, is a chat. This is about having a chat. It really is. People think that this is going to be a really somber and morbid conversation, and that's why they don't want to go there. But actually, if you have the courage and if you have the context, it can be just an incredibly illuminating chat. And many people, in fact, most people, I would say, have reported to me that when they have actually plucked up the courage and broached the subject, they are surprised and delighted at how close they feel with the person that they're talking to, how much, what they discover, and how relieved as well. It's amazing how many people are relieved that somebody has had the guts to bring this up, because actually many people think about it, but in the back of their mind. So employ those, and I think it will help.
I think that's really helpful, the 3 C's. And what do you think are the advantages for people to use end of life solutions like yourself?
Yeah, so let me just explain briefly what an end of life plan is, because most people know about a will and a funeral, and we're talking about actually quite a lot more than that. So yes, you do need a will, and yes, you do need to have not necessarily a funeral plan like like you go along and you pay your money and you get a plan organized for you by a funeral director. My idea of a funeral plan is you just knowing what it is that you want, which may include a funeral director doing everything for you, but it might be you doing the opposite, which is everything yourself. If you want to do things yourself, which you can, except nobody knows that, then you have to plan in advance because there's lots of things to think about. But the other areas are your powers of attorney. That's the people that you appoint to look after your health or your finances. If you can't, for whatever reason, do it, whether it's because you're dead or whether it's because, no, not if you're dead, because powers of attorney are only apply when you're still alive, but you can't manage your own life. And sadly, that's happening more and more as more people grow older, but they're not in good enough health in their later years. So those are really important. And then there's another whole area of advanced care planning where we are talking about particularly a form in England. It's called the Advanced Decision. In Scotland, Advanced Directive. Other countries have slightly different names, but it's basically the statement that you make about the treatment that you don't want to receive towards the end of your life. Now, this is really important and people don't understand about it because basically in the Western world, our healthcare system is set up to treat you no matter what. You will get treated to keep you alive. And if that's not what you think you might want, you need to thought it through in advance and specify it. So that's quite a big area to really be thinking about. And then these days, we also have your digital life, because people are going to continue on living digitally unless you take care of it beforehand. So again, that requires a lot of thinking. The action to take care of it is not so onerous. Most of, for example, the social media sites have an option for you to go and appoint somebody to look after your account, should you not be able to do that. You just Google whatever social media site it is and put in memorial site or memorial person, or they all have different ways of doing it. But if you put in end of death, what happens if I die, that sort of thing, they will have got a process for doing that. But you have to have thought it through beforehand. And that's the really important thing, because some people want to be remembered in this way after they died and other people don't. And some members of the family have different opinions about all this, as you can imagine. So, for example, after my husband died, he had a Facebook page and I had that taken down immediately. I knew he didn't want that up and I didn't want it either. But 3 months later, we had another family tragedy when my step-granddaughter, who was only 16, also died. And in those days, teenagers were on Facebook a lot, and her page was up for at least a year, if not longer. And it was clear from the messages that were put on it that her friends and her family were loving using this as a way to remember her. So that's why you have to think about it. And then there's another area that I say is really important, and it's a little bit, we touched on it earlier, which is about how you want to be remembered. So do you want to be remembered by giving away specific things to particular people? Do you want to create something now that, like a memoir? My dad, for example, with a bit of encouragement from me, quite a lot of encouragement from me actually, wrote his 20 pages of what had gone on in his life. It was so lovely to read. And it was only a few months after that he had a stroke and was completely unable to do anything, and then died a year later. But, it could be that you create a dance performance, or that you write some poems, or that you do a particular video, anything, just thinking about it. So all these are components of an end-of-life plan. And I haven't answered your original question, which are what the benefits. So let me come to that now. I felt I had to say that because most people don't know what this is. It's a new area.
I have to say, it's so fascinating because I did not know that you could appoint someone about your social media.
Yeah.
And I had some times when I thought, oh my gosh, what if I die? And my sisters don't know all my passwords. It's going to be so difficult.
Yeah.
To figure all of these things out.
It is difficult. And so that brings us on to one of the practical and emotional benefits, actually, because if you've never lost anybody close to you, then this is just in theory. But when it happens, you are grieving serious stuff. And it's easy to think that you're thinking straight, but you're not necessarily. It's also much more difficult to make decisions. So when you have to do administration like this, it's just an added extra that you don't really need. If all you have to do is follow instructions because the person who's died has left those in advance, or you've discussed it with them and you know where the documentation is, God, that makes such a difference. It really does. So it happened with my mum and dad. They died a couple of years ago, and they were really good students of mine. They thought what I was doing was wonderful. So they had their Before I Go workbook all completed. They had a print version, they weren't interested in doing anything online. And we'd talked about it all. All I had to do as their executor was go and look at what they had said. And it made things so much easier. So both from an emotional and a practical point of view, that really helps. But again, I made a couple of notes about this, so that's why I'm looking down here. Yeah, I tell you, you would be surprised at how many families argue about what should be done. Even the families who swear right now that we would never argue, we would never do that. I'm really sorry to say, but it does happen. And it happens because of the effect of grief, which is so unpredictable and takes people in different ways that you can't say in advance what you're going to do. Mm-hmm. So by planning, by saying what you want, and again, we've seen this with Prince Philip, he said, and it was all written down years ago, what he wanted. And it's really different from what is normally done. Mm-hmm. Just imagine if that hadn't happened, all the palace courtiers and as well as all the family members would have had opinions. And people do have opinions about this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So it really makes it a lot easier practically and emotionally to have that taken care of, because arguments go out the window, because everybody naturally wants to do what the person wanted. That's because it gives us pleasure, to do that. Mm-hmm. And of course, it also saves time and money and stress. And then from the emotional point of view, and here's another surprising thing maybe, when you do your own planning, when you're well, before any idea that you might be dying, we all know that we will die and nobody really wants to pay attention to that. But if we're willing to face up to the idea in theory, it's amazing what happens, because you get to appreciate what you have got right now much more. And also you get to get really clear on what your priorities are and what is important. And that's why we have this thing called a bucket list, And usually people think of that as going traveling or whatever it is, jumping out of a plane. Ghastly thought, I wouldn't be doing that. But actually, it can be as simple as, I just want to make sure that I'm growing this particular plant in my garden now, so that in 10 years' time, it's going to look the way I imagine it in my head now, for example, which means that you prioritize going to the garden centre that weekend, perhaps. I don't know, but I'm saying that because I'm looking out at my garden at the moment. So yeah, those are unexpected benefits, I think, if you have the courage to go down this route in the first place.
I love that. And I think you sort of covered it a little bit there, but I was thinking about your book, The Gifts of Grief. Yeah. And in your experience, what do you think was the gift that comes up most prominently for you in your experience of grief?
For me, the main gift of Philip dying was understanding that we are, and experiencing that we are so much more than a body. That was revolutionary for me, because although I'd been on a spiritual seeking path for many years, this was taking me to a much, much deeper level. And I discovered, and this is what the main part of the book was about, was my journey in that way. This is why I was so surprised when people went, I thought people would love that, but actually what they liked was the practical questions. But so I felt like for me now, it's, I have no doubt whatsoever that who I am is energy flowing through a body called Jane. Energy that also flowed through a body that was called Philip and that died. And I can say that because I was with him when he died, and he was there one minute and then he wasn't. It looked like he was, but he wasn't. So I'm sure some of the listeners will be able to identify with that. But, you know, for me, about 2 or 3 weeks later, I woke up one morning and I thought, that was an empty bag lying on the bed in the hospital there. So what is this bag, my body, what is this bag filled with? And I really needed to find out. So that was the major gift that his death brought me. And it allowed me to call the book Gifted by Grief, but I could easily have said Gifted by Death, because now I actually do feel grateful for both Philip's life and for his death. And of course, in relationship to the work I do now as well.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I agree. I think it made me a seeker. That's what I always think, because I was always thinking, well, what happens when you die from a really young age? And not many people kind of think about death. And I just love what you're bringing to everybody's awareness, and taking death sort of out of the closet, if you like, and making it accessible and making it something, you know, not to be all sort of scared of and shy away from.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was thinking about the words conscious grief. And one of the things that I learned, you know, because I had been working as a counsellor for years and years and years, so I'd learned about grief and bereavement. But when Philip died, oh my God, and that was a different story. The intensity of the emotion was incredible. And the one thing that I knew was that my old teacher, Louise Hay, had said, what you feel, you can heal. So I knew that it was important just to feel the feelings. And although I didn't think about it quite like this at the time, looking back, I could see that this is what happened. When a feeling came knocking at the door, so to speak, it would probably be one that I didn't want to feel because it would feel uncomfortable. And what I learned was that I needed, instead of locking the door and pulling down the blinds, which is, you know, what we usually want to do, actually what I needed to do was open the windows, open the front door, welcome the feeling in, and at the same time have the back door of my house open so that the feeling could easily come in and easily go. And that's what I learned. And that's what I encourage people to do now, is to just let the feelings be there, because they will go, they will change. That's one guaranteed thing. So one minute you'll feel amazing, and the next minute you'll feel terrible, and the next minute angry or fearful, whatever it is. And it can include feelings of happiness and joy as well. I mean, really unusual things. But it doesn't matter if you're not judging them, if you're allowing them to come in and then they go. That's the process of grief. So that's what I say. When they come knocking, just allow them to flow, as well as the ones that you like. Because usually with the ones we like, we want to trap them in the house, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And to want to stay there and feel like any other feeling we want to move away from as quickly as possible. But actually, that's what makes us human, isn't it? That's what our experience here in this body is different to the spirit.
Yeah, exactly. So it takes courage, because, you know, it might be that you're out somewhere and you're suddenly, I can remember being in a coffee shop, and now this was not in relationship to Philip, funnily enough. This was in relationship to the fact that when I was around about 40, I was facing up to the fact that I was never going to be having children. And that was quite difficult for me at the time. And I was sitting in the coffee shop with a Hello magazine open, and Princess Caroline of Monaco was there. She's about the same age as me, and she had her grandchildren there. And I just burst into tears. And I knew at that point that it was important to just let the tears be there. But do you do that in a coffee shop? Well, I found a way. You know, I probably didn't carry on drinking my coffee. I maybe got up and left, but I didn't stop them. And I think that was the really important thing. And it's not always possible to do that, and because you don't always feel safe enough, and it depends what the feeling is anyway. But, you know, for the most part, if you possibly can allow that feeling to be there, I would be encouraging that.
Yeah, thank you. So your definition of conscious grief is really just to feel the feelings and embrace all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And with, because it is really fascinating that you and your husband were both psychotherapists.
Yeah.
So was your husband quite accepting at these last stages of his transition, or was it still difficult?
It was still difficult, and he was 66 when he actually died. He had just turned 66. He didn't want to die. He felt like there was loads more for him to do still in the world. He'd had a very difficult run up to this in terms, before he got cancer, he'd had chronic fatigue for 10 years, but he hadn't been able to really deal with that properly. When he got the cancer diagnosis, he did an amazing about turn and started addressing quite a lot of issues in his life that had not been resolved. So although his body didn't heal in terms of being able to continue being here, he healed at a lot of other levels. And that, in the last few days, brought him some peace. Yeah. And I remember he said to me, because he died in the hospital, and this was maybe 2 or 3 days before the end, as it turned out, he said that he felt that he had finally come to peace with not knowing, because he was quite an intellectual and really wanted to know about all sorts of things and had an amazing brain and could contain facts and all the rest of it, was interested in everything. But he found it hard being with not knowing, which of course was the journey he was facing. But that was really lovely for me to hear, because I felt that he'd come to some place of resolution in terms of what was going to be happening next. And, you know, when he actually died, I was expecting that I would feel his presence around in the room. Not a thing, not a thing. I was amazed. He just went. He must have been ready by that time, you know. And actually that felt good to me as well.
Thank you for sharing that with me. I really appreciate it. And I know that we're coming up to time. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we finish the interview?
Well, I think if people have been motivated by this idea of, oh, actually we could plan or we could have a conversation, then on my website, beforeigosolutions.com, you can click on the a free quiz. It just takes 30 seconds. It's just 10 questions where there are yes or no questions as to what you've already got in place. And it's illuminating, because there's quite a few things that people don't know that they don't know. So if you go to beforeigosolutions.com/big-quiz, then you'll find it. And you can sign up for the mailing list there if you want to, but you don't have to. You can just do the quiz and discover what you've got in place and what you haven't. And you can find me on Facebook as well. I hang out there quite a lot under my name.
Okay, that's so good to hear. Thank you, because I'm also going to have it. You'll have a link at the bottom of this, so you can go over to the website and see all the wonderful services you provide, because it's so valuable. And I think the more and more people who know about the things that you offer, the better, because I think that's also part of having a conscious grief or a conscious death, isn't it? To be prepared.
Very much so. And, you know, it's part of our mission is to have end of life plans be as commonplace as birth plans, so that having conversations about dying, death and grief is normal. You know, it's not normal yet, but that's what I would love to happen in my lifetime.
Yes, I think that is really wonderful. Oh, well, it's just been such a pleasure. I'm so delighted to learn more about you and to continue following what you do. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.